They called me because the animals were being opened with a surgeon's patience, not a scavenger's greed. That line, clean incisions, organs removed with deliberate precision, no chewing, no scatter, was the sort of thing you live long enough in the field to see and think you can name. Coyotes do certain things. Mountain lions leave patterns. Bears crush and gnaw. But whatever had been working the San Rafael Swell had a signature that fit none of the lists in my head, and that was the first reason everyone who knew the terrain had an instinct to step back. My name is Wade. I ran wildlife control in 3 western counties for most of my career. I trailed predators, consulted on depredation claims, coordinated with ranchers and agents from Fish and Game and Federal Wildlife Services. I've sat in trucks at 2 in the morning watching a lion slip along a fence line, and I've stood in court explaining why a trap was the only humane option left. The work trains you to catalog, to classify, to make uncomfortable things legible. It gives you a vocabulary for unknowns, and it gives you procedures to lean on when the map of the problem gets complicated. That was all I had when Harlan called. Harlan Dairy ranches on the northeastern flank of the Swell. He and his family run winter and summer pastures across badlands that look older than dispute, folded sandstone, slick rock ledges, narrow slot canyons that swallow sound. Harlan's voice on the phone was the thing I'd heard for years, practical, tired, and quick to cut past civility when animals and livelihood were at stake. He didn't waste time with the usual small talk. "Wade, I need you to come look at these," he said. "We're losing cows, not in the usual way." By the time I hit pavement, it was late afternoon. The light over the Swell was the kind of gold that softens the edges of cliffs and makes the empty country look like a stage. People talk about the Swell like they talk about old men who have secrets. You respect it enough to keep your distance. There's a geography here that favors anything that wants to hide. Alcoves and benches, an up-and-down labyrinth where a thing can vanish, and 3 hours later be on a different ridge. That geography would do more than shield whatever we were tracking. It would become an active part of the problem. Harlan met me at the gate in his pickup. Up close, the worry in his eyes was plain. He had the lines of a man who measures loss in numbers and nights spent awake. His neighbor, Maggie, came with him. She'd lost more than cattle. She knew those canyons like the back of her hand, and she'd been the one to find the first kill that didn't make sense. Maggie moved with a compact, patient intensity. Her hands were calloused, and when she spoke, people listened. We went to the first site together. The carcass lay under a juniper, shaded from the late sun, and knowing the job I'd done for so long, I treated it like a case file. You go in noticing the obvious things first: location, position, signs of a struggle, presence or absence of blood trails. Then you slow down and look for signature, what a predator left in the way it fed, the choices it made. This thing's choices were the problem. The carcass was of a yearling, medium-sized young, and it was clear from the outset it hadn't been dragged. There was no sign of the tearing, the pulling at the hide you expect when an animal becomes prey in a scramble. The hide had been opened along a precise incision that didn't appear ragged. The organs that would normally provide the mess of a predator feed were neatly removed. There was surgical cleanliness to the wound edges, but no tool marks you could lay physical evidence at. The bones were largely intact. There was none of the crushing you'd expect from a creature that needed to break marrow. Nothing had been dragged off. Nothing appeared eaten beyond the deliberate removals. I noted the absence of tooth marks on the ribs and around the sternum. No chewing in the usual places, no gnawing of the vertebrae. Where a wolf or a mountain lion leaves strips and tears, this removal was economy and selectivity. The language of the kill suggested purpose. That's a word we use carefully. Purpose in killing implies some cognition, some pattern to desire, not the random opportunism of scavengers. Tracks were the second story. They were fresh, and they told of movement that was not quite animal and not quite human. The impressions were three-toed, with a distinct rear spur, like a sickle, making a punctiform mark at the heel. The stride was long for the overall size, long enough to suggest a bipedal gait, and the spacing single file rather than the shuffle you see in many quadrupeds. The depth of the impressions suggested weight, but not the bulk of a bear. There were no claw drags. Prints were often at the edge of the carcass, as if the animal stood and worked above the prey rather than dragging it away. And around the area, where one might expect evidence of a den or bedding site, we found feathers, dark, iridescent, arranged in small clusters, and small patches where eggshell had been crushed. Broken shell fragments were not consistent with accidental breakage. They were oriented, almost placed. I didn't see anything I could name confidently. Not all tracks are definitive, and I never trusted a single piece of evidence in isolation. But the pattern was anomalous enough that I took careful photos and measurements with an engineer's neatness. 2 marks to remember from that day: the sickle spur and the 3-toe impression. Those 2 details would not, in any of my checklists, point to a known predator I was willing to stake a trap or a shoot order on. We walked the line of prints along the canyon bench and into a narrow draw. The terrain switched from open ledge to an inward world of stone ribs and alcoves. The air here felt older. Sound collapsed. Maggie kept close, her eyes scanning the ledges like they were places that could move. I asked her the obvious question nobody likes to ask a woman with losses. "You think it's a bird," I said, because the feathers had suggested something. "It thinks like something that's been left alone a long time," she answered. "Whatever it is, it's been using the same places for years." Her answer carried the sting of grief more than any fear. Maggie's ranch had been in her family for generations. She wasn't calling me for drama. She was calling for a resolution she hoped would make the past survive the present. There was a cache in the first sandstone alcove we found. Not quite a midden, not quite a den. Skulls, small ruminant skulls, clean to a pale bone, were arranged along a ledge in a pattern that suggested intent. They weren't strewn. They weren't piled for consumption. They were set like trophies or markers. A few were placed with their faces turned in the same direction. A couple were stacked as if forming a low cairn. The alcove smelled faintly of old blood and of organic decay, but it was not the smell of a fresh kill so much as the smell that clings to long-stored material. This was not opportunistic feeding. This was curation. I ran the possibilities through my head. Human activity, a poacher, a cult, a kid playing with bones. It's the sort of thing everyone first wants to blame on people, because people are neat and understandable and have motives we can pin down. There were no footprints other than the 3-toed prints I'd been following. The alcove showed no sign of campfire soot, no human-made tools, and the placement of bones in deep shadow suggested behavior other than curiosity, something that could haul and arrange without leaving human trace. A line of feathers lay like a makeshift curtain in a recessed pocket. They were the same type we'd seen earlier, but this time there were more. Full remiges with structural stiffness. The feathers were not molted randomly. They appeared selected for size and pattern. Nearby lay small fragments of eggshell, the inner membrane dried and papery. I handled nothing beyond gloved impressions and photographs, partly out of procedure, and partly because I didn't want to leave my scent in someone else's arrangement. Observing is a form of restraint in this job. We collect evidence. We don't disturb the scene if we can avoid it. And that detachment is the thing that keeps the narrative honest. Harlan and Maggie said the same thing in different words. This wasn't just killing to feed. There was selection involved. Calves with healthy hide were left alone. Older cows were chosen. There was a preference for certain organs, sometimes bones removed, sometimes left. The pattern suggested long-term behavior rather than recent adaptation. That implied 2 things that made me uneasy. First, whatever this was had learned techniques I couldn't attribute to common predators. Second, whatever this was had been doing it long enough to develop rituals. As professionals, we try to translate ritual into motive, but motive is a slipperier thing than footprint measurement. It can be human or non-human. It can be survivability or display or something neither term covers. All we had was pattern. We spent 2 days moving through the maze of the swell. We set up observational points, where we could, without being obvious, took photos, and spoke to the ranch hands about when the attacks occurred. They came at odd hours, sometimes dusk, sometimes deep into the night, sometimes at dawn. The timing suggested a comfort operating in hours of low human presence, but not an exclusive avoidance of daylight. That flexibility made the problem harder to manage. Creatures that conform to our schedules are easier to trap or deter. On the second evening, after a long day of walking and cataloguing, we found another site deeper in the canyons. This one had a different tenor. It felt older, like the air remembered things. A narrow amphitheater opened like a bowl. Concentric benches eroded into a natural stage. At the lip of one bench were more skulls, smaller this time, caprine maybe, and a string of feathers like beads. A slab nearby had been used as a flat surface. The surface was polished not by hands, but by repetitive contact. It was a place of repeated return. Harlan stood with his hat in his hands. He'd lost 2 beasts now in ways that would ruin a season if they continued. "We called the county," he said. "They sent a man out last week. Did his walk-around, wrote a report. Said probably coyotes, said clean up carcasses, increase lights, same old lines." You could see the helplessness in him. The institutional answer had been the default one: classify, box, and prescribe a standard response. Coyotes are the easy explanation. They fit many situations. But the evidence in our hands didn't fit the coyote mold. The county's man had limited options: permits, agency liability, and public messaging restrain response. That is what agencies do. They balance public safety, legal liability, and finite resources. But balancing can look like avoidance when a problem refuses to be classified. That night, we camped on a flat bench under a sky brilliant with stars. We kept the truck between us and the draw, lights off, conserving the quiet. Maggie slept in a shell of habitual vigilance. I slept as one does on older bones, half awake, listening for disruption. I had a small tent, the kind you use in the desert to cut wind. I'm not naive about the safety of a tent in a canyon when you're dealing with predators, but we weighed the options. There was no place to put up a tower, and we didn't want to burn a fire that would draw every scavenger in the area. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of controlled breathing above me. You learn the differences between breath types when you spend nights near animals. The shallow, repetitive huff of a resting coyote is one thing. The staccato breath of something calling is another. This was neither. It was measured, slow, and too close. I lay there and listened. The tent fabric was taut, and above it something shifted. In my head, I ran through the practical options: make noise and risk provoking an attack, light and risk drawing attention, stay still and hope it passes. Protocol leans toward caution. My hands stayed under my sleeping bag, because the act of rising makes you visible in way your stillness does not. I saw a foot. Against the mesh of my tent, a silhouette moved, a long appendage, not a paw, but something with a blade-like curvature at the rear. The outline suggested a long, backward-swept claw, like the sickle spur I'd seen in the prints. The foot flexed and rested, and the shadow of weight shifted as if the thing above were testing the resistance of the material. I was not armed in a useful way from inside a tent. My service pistol was in the truck in a locked case because, for all my experience, there are protocols about leaving weapons unattended, and I had chosen to leave it out of reach, rather than to risk a discharge in cramped quarters. I remember an old training admonition: do not turn your back on something unknown, but the other part of that training insists on restraint. Recognize when your reaction makes the situation worse. I lay there paralyzed by decision more than by any physical immobilization. The thing above circled the tent, breathing, shifting its weight at intervals directly over us. It was deliberate and unreadable. Once I felt, not saw felt, a vibration through the tent fabric like a short, low staccato. 3 clicks in rapid succession. The sound might have been wind if you were feeling charitable. It might have been intentional communication if you weren't. The morning came and the light was wrong for the smell of the night. The camp was exactly as we'd left it, our gear in the same places, footprints only from our group and the truck. But outside, the prints were new. They had come from different directions, circled our chosen bench and left again toward the interior. There was a pattern. The tracks made a widening spiral around our site, stopping at regular intervals and then continuing. It wasn't the behavior of predator stalking for kill. It was testing, mapping, close scrutiny. The thing had walked our perimeter in quiet, and then melted back into the stone. Maggie was white-faced and quiet. She had gone down to the small spring at the lip of the draw before dawn to check the water. When she returned, she could not remember how long she'd been gone. Her eyes were like someone who had seen a shape that the mind cannot place. She told us she had felt a presence, like a hand passing over her, and then nothing, just the smell of wet feathers and the faint metallic tang of old blood. She could not say whether she had been watched or whether she had watched. Sometimes human memory leaves gaps under stress. Sometimes it leaves marks that are not ours to fix. The tracks made a neat, unnerving record. Around our camp the soil showed the same three-toed impressions we'd been following, each print bearing the characteristic sickle mark at the heel. The spacing indicated a gait that favored long steps and balance on 2 feet. The circled pattern suggested interest, study, and perhaps worst of all for our agency-minded minds, an absence of immediate aggression. An animal that studies before deciding is not easily deterred by noise or lights. We moved deeper into the canyon that morning, following those impressions until they led us to a ledge where the light changed and the air felt cooler. The ledge opened onto a pocket where something had been lived in. Here the remains were older, bones bleached from time, feathers matted into stone crevices, a small spiral of stones laid like a primitive marker. It looked, on surface alone, like signs of repeated occupation. The pattern repeated across multiple pockets, curated remains, feather deposits, eggshell fragments, small skulls displayed. Harlan stood with his jaw set. "So why won't the agencies do anything?" he asked. But the question was not only for me. He knew our institution's limitations. He wanted to hear me voice the logic. I told him what I had to as plainly as I could. Agencies are structured to deal with knowns, I said. Species identification, permits, health concerns, liability. If it's a known predator, there are sanctioned responses, removal, depredation permits, public advisories. If it's something that doesn't fit the policy boxes, the options shrink. People get worried about liability on both sides. You send crews into terrain that's hazardous with an unknown threat, and if someone gets hurt, you've escalated the problem. You report it up the chain. Somebody runs it through the standard forms, and if the conclusion is indeterminate, often the default is de-escalation, limited response, public messaging to reduce panic, and avoidance of exposure. "You think they'll call it coyotes and go home?" Maggie asked. "It's the path of least resistance," I said. "If they can walk away and say, no clear evidence of anything out of the ordinary, then they can avoid permits, a public relations mess, and potential liability if field crews are injured or worse. It's a legal and bureaucratic self-preservation." Her face hardened in a way that made my chest tighten. Humans make rules to make the world predictable. When the world refuses the categories, institutions, even well-meaning ones, recoil into procedure, because procedure is a form of safety. But when procedure becomes avoidance, people with land and livelihoods get left with the costs. That afternoon, as we photographed more cache sites and mapped tracks, we found something I hadn't expected. A shallow depression with the tiniest of eggshell fragments surrounding it, as if a nest had once been there and been broken on purpose. The nest site suggested not random consumption, but a behavior pattern connected to reproduction or brood care. If that was true, we were dealing with a creature embedded in the landscape, not just a transient predator working opportunistically. Every piece of evidence tightened a knot of possibilities I couldn't unravel. An avian ancestor, with ritualistic behavior that had adapted to a carnivorous niche. An unknown bipedal predator with feathering and talons. Or some learned behavior by a known animal that had drifted into a new ecological niche. Each answer carried measures of hazard for people and for the agencies that might be asked to intervene. A species that could hide in the swell's maze, avoid traps, and choose its encounters would be an operational nightmare. Extracting it would likely require more than a handful of biologists and a standard trap lay. It would require time, resources, and safety procedures the county simply did not have in reserve. That evening, as the sun slid behind the ridges and the shadows lengthened into the stone, we prepared to retrace our steps out of the canyon. We hadn't found what we had hoped for, definitive sign that would produce a neat policy answer. We had found a pattern that refused tidy conclusions. Harlan's face was worn. Maggie's hands trembled a little when she lifted her water can. We were tired, and the canyon made the rest of the world feel far away. I have made a life on decisions in these kinds of moments. To press, to withdraw, to open the case file and escalate, or to note the unknown and take a conservative approach. There is a professional humility baked into the work. When evidence does not suffice, you do not pretend conclusion. You write the observation and you protect what you can. This is the calculus we would bring back to town. A list of anomalies, photographs, measurements, and a carefully worded report that would be handed to Fish and Game and whatever regional wildlife services had jurisdiction. We would recommend caution and surveillance. We would ask for more resources. We would wait to see what the institutions could or would do. I slept that night with the tent facing the canyon mouth. I told myself it was sensible. The truth was more complicated. My whole career had conditioned me to expect the known and to catalogue the unknown until the pieces aligned. Out here, the pieces had a way of refusing alignment. You can feel that refusal like a pressure against the back of your neck. At twilight, I wandered back to the alcove where the skulls were arranged. The light cut the ledges into stark plains. The bones caught the last of the sun and glowed like small moons. Picking my way among them, I felt a prickle along my skin that had nothing to do with cold. For the first time since I'd handled a badge and a clipboard, I felt the distinct impression of being observed. It's a stupid thing to say aloud when you are a man whose trade is observation, but the swell had a way of inverting roles. There are places where the land makes you the one being watched. I left the alcove with more photos and a note in my field journal. Pattern: deliberate removal and curation, three-toed bipedal tracks with rear spur, repeated occupation sites with feather deposits and egg fragments. Behavior: selection and display, possible brood care. Risk: unknown, avoids confrontation, circles campsites, difficult terrain. I also wrote, with a clarity I would not let myself have earlier, operational hazard: treacherous terrain plus unidentified predator, high injury probability for field agents, institutional response likely limited. The next morning we packed up to head down out of the canyon. We were quiet in the truck. The country shuts down conversation in a different way than city traffic ever does. Harlan wanted to take a last pass along the ridge. He wanted to see if anything had been touched in the night. Perhaps he was looking for comfort in a final tally. Perhaps he wanted to collect evidence of the thing he had been living under. We found fresh prints again, not far from where we'd camped. They radiated away from the ledge like spokes and then disappeared into a crack in the rock. The tracks were shallow where the powdery sand had collected after wind, and in the hollow of the fracture, we could see faint drag marks as if something had passed a hand along the stone. The fracture itself opened on a drop, and beyond it, the canyon bottom narrowed into a throat of shadow. For a second, standing over that crack, the swell felt like a mouth. "I've seen enough to know this isn't something we can set a trap for and close the book," I said quietly. I didn't want to scare them with the institutional realities, permits, insurance, the time it takes to marshal resources. But I also wanted them to understand the honest professional assessment. This thing did not conform to the usual counters. Harlan spit on the ground and wiped his hands on his trousers. "So what do we do?" he asked. "The question is at the core of everything. What do you do when the language you've been given about nature doesn't cover the thing you're facing?" The planned part of my brain started listing options: more cameras, a temporary surveillance array, a specialized retrieval team. But the rest of me knew those steps would take time. Neither the agencies nor Harlan could easily spare. Mobilizing a response in that terrain was expensive and risky. Sending personnel into a labyrinth with an unknown threat is a decision agencies do not take lightly. Their calculus includes more than the moral imperative to intervene. It includes protecting personnel and minimizing liability. What I did instead was make a small, careful plan with the ranchers. We would increase observation, stagger the presence of human watchers to throw off the creature's patterning, and report our findings formally. I would draft the report. I would push for a limited specialist consult from a regional wildlife services unit. That would be the professional way forward. But even as I formatted my recommendations in my head, I felt the low rising current of dread. The 2-week lag in formal response, the narrow bandwidth of the specialists, the logistical hazards of fielding teams in the swell. In my experience, those are the crucibles where institutional will either forms around a problem or the problem becomes someone else's headache. We drove out of the canyon with the last of the light pooling on the hood, the skulls and feathers left in place, as if the land had been asked to hold a secret. Harlan watched the stone recede in the rearview mirror, like a losing argument. Maggie drove in silence, jaw set. I sat between their lives and the procedural machinery that had to be engaged if anything was to be done. The way I phrased the report later was careful and clinical. I documented the kills, the signature of the wounds, the track morphology, and the repeated occupation of alcoves. I appended photographs and marked GPS points where we could. I recommended caution and specialist involvement. When the report was filed, I had done what my oath of professionalism required: thorough documentation and prudent recommendations. What I hadn't done was resolve the fear sitting in the hollow of my throat. The thing that had breathed over the tent had not left a matchbook of evidence that would make anyone in an office understand the gravity of field danger. Paper cannot capture the smell of feathers at dawn or the sound of a creature circling a camp. Later, when I briefed an agent from Fish and Game by phone, he was patient in the way of institutional processes. "We'll review your documentation," he said. "If it warrants, we'll allocate a team." He added all the qualifying language agencies use: permits, safety protocols, specialist engagement. And while I listened, I could hear how the machine of bureaucracy gears toward caution. It's not that the people on the other end lacked will. They were simply subject to systems designed to minimize exposure to risk. Those systems are necessary, and in ordinary cases, they protect both staff and the public. But in circumstances like the Swell, where the unknown refuses categorization, those systems can be the reason a response is delayed or diluted. By the time the agent returned our call with the required forms and the polite practiced line about limited resources, I had the creeping certainty that things would not change quickly. That is not an accusation, it is an observation. Agencies are rightly protective of their teams. They need to be. They also operate in a legal and political environment where every step is moderated by risk assessments. When the risk evaluation concludes that response would endanger personnel without a clear likelihood of resolution, the institution's answer will often be to document and defer. For people in the field, that looks a lot like abandonment. We had more tracks to follow and more alcoves to photograph. We had the taste of something studied and deliberate in our mouths. We had a report filed and the polite, insufficient promise of review. We had a night on the edge of a canyon that had been circled by a thing that tested our perimeter and left no trace of intent beyond the demonstration of interest. And we had the knowledge that whatever animal or thing we were dealing with was not likely to respond to the usual countermeasures. There are other softer reasons institutions step back too: public relations fallout, fear of creating panic, the political heat of acknowledging a risk without immediate remedy. Harlan mentioned that last part out loud as we sat on the tailgate watching the landscape. If they put out a panic notice, he said, people start coming: journalists, hunters with rats in their pockets, tourists. That only makes things worse. It's a paradox of the modern age. Visibility can be both cure and contagion. For something that uses obscurity as part of its survival strategy, drawing attention can change the calculus in unintended ways. A creature that had been selecting kills and storing parts in alcoves could be pushed into different behavior by increased human activity. That might sound like a reason to intervene, but it's also a reason agencies weigh the consequences in terms of broader risk. Intervention in the wrong way could exacerbate danger for both humans and the non-human entity at the center of the mystery. We left the Swell that day with the weight of unanswered questions and a thin folder of evidence. My professional instinct wanted to press: more cameras, bait trials, helicopters, but the canyon's geometry and the creature's apparent intelligence suggested those measures would either fail or tip the balance in the wrong direction. I filed my report and put pressure where I could, but an institutional machine moves on its own cadence. Back at the ranch, as dusk gathered into a chill, Maggie took me aside and showed me a small hand-carved token she'd found tucked behind a slab near the alcove. It was a fragment of wood etched with patterns like a primitive chevron. "My husband used to say this country remembers people one way or another," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor underneath. "I don't know what it remembers now." I felt a kinship with that uncertainty. There are things you see in the field that teach you limits, the boundary between what an agency can do and what the land itself dictates. Standing on dirt swept by a wind that knew more roots than maps can contain, I felt the landscape close around us with a patient indifference. It was clear in that moment why the role of institutions can be fraught here. You can marshal expertise, you can draft forms, you can call in specialists, but the terrain decides who gets to act. That night I dreamed of a place where the rock swallowed the sound of voices and left only the clicks of a thing attentive and patient. I dreamed of the amphitheater and the skulls, and of a face leering from between the ledges like a question. I woke with a tightness behind my ribs I hadn't felt since my first year on the job. The first time I had to tell a rancher the agency couldn't guarantee a solution. We had an appointment to make our formal handover to Fish and Game. I had gathered what I could: photos with scale, GPS coordinates, witness statements, measured impressions. We would submit the packet and wait, perhaps for weeks, while the bureaucracy filtered, assessed, and allocated. In the interim, Harlan and Maggie would have to make decisions about herding patterns and night watch. That kind of temporary mitigation is not a solution, it's triage. As we drove back toward the highway, leaving the swell's teeth behind, I kept thinking about the campsite and the way those prints had arranged themselves around us, like a ring of questions without answers. It is one thing to know that an animal behaves in a way that is difficult to manage. It is another to see in the field evidence that suggests cognition and intent beyond simple predation. Whatever we were dealing with could plan, observe, and choose. Those traits do not make it evil, they make it operationally hazardous. There are formal avenues to escalate, specialist teams with the equipment to work in dangerous terrain, agreements to protect liability, and, if necessary, permits to take decisive action. But those things take time and political will. They require clear identification and classification. Without those, the bureaucratic machine is designed to minimize exposure and defer. That's the second reason an agency might step back. Not because they do not care, but because the structure of their mandate and the limits of their resources make intervention irresponsible by their metrics. We arrived at the county office the following morning with the packet and a stack of photographs on a thumb drive. The agent we met with looked at the documentation with a professional face. He had a familiarity with odd cases, but his answers were shaped by policy. Under current guidelines, he said, we can't authorize extraordinary measures without a definitive species identification or an imminent public safety threat. We will file for a specialist consult. In the meantime, increase watch hours and secure the herd. I watched his face. I listened for the strain between professional care and structural limitation. You can see it in the windows of bureaucracies, people trapped between duty and the frameworks that define how duty can be carried out. That tension is not always visible to those outside the system. For ranchers like Harlan and Maggie, it looks like inaction. For agents, it looks like following policy. When I left the office, I felt like we had done everything we could within the rules. We had not, however, solved anything. The field had given me a report, the institution had given me a protocol, the canyon had given me a startle that would sit with me. The thing I could not shake was how the swell itself seemed to nudge the gears of governance toward withdrawal. Rocks do not bend to forms. They simply are inhospitable to certain lines of human intervention. We arranged for a few camera setups, placed in locations that would not interfere with private property rights and avoided sensitive habitats. I insisted on remote triggers and data collection only in legal parameters. We did not bait, we did not trap, and we did not set up anything that would expose people to the risk of close encounter. Even so, cameras would be a delay, not a solution. They would create a record and maybe an image to shove into a form. If that image showed something the agencies could classify, the response might change. If not, we would have more photos and the same set of constraints. As the day dimmed, I drove back to the edge of the swell and walked the ridge one last time. The wind carried a scent like old bones and rain-washed dust, and somewhere below a canyon swallow called to itself. The prints we'd been following traced patterns into the earth like a riddle. My professional instincts had a hierarchy of responses. The first was to protect life. The second was to document. The third was to attempt containment. All three of those instincts were frustrated by the same factors: the creature's apparent intelligence and selectivity, the swell's impenetrable geography, and the institutional limits of response. Those factors are the scaffolding of the answer to the title question. Why would wildlife control abandon the San Rafael Swell. It's not a single thing. It is a knot of overlapping realities, danger beyond easy mitigation, terrain that prevents safe intervention, a creature that does not fit policy definitions, the risk calculus of agencies protecting human life first, and the social consequences of publicizing an ambiguous threat. Each of those reasons is born from the evidence we collected, the surgical signature of the kills, the three-toed tracks with their rear spur, the caches and arranged skulls, the nest sites with egg fragments, and the creature's behavior the night it circled our tent. But even as I began to understand the institutional logic that pushes toward withdrawal, I could not let go of the sight of the amphitheater in the canyon, the place where the ledges gathered like seats and where the skulls had been mounted as if the stone itself were an audience. I kept thinking of it as a theater of decisions. Someone or something sat center stage and watched us watch, and when it grew aware of our presence, it did not attack. It observed. It measured. And in doing so, it raised the stakes for anyone who would try to intervene. We filed the documentation and arranged surveillance, but I knew the gap between paperwork and action could be long. I knew, too, that between the time we left the swell and the setu, and the moment someone could legally, logistically, and safely move men into those ledges, there was a dangerous window, time for the unknown to keep doing whatever it did without human interruption. That gap is where most problems either resolve themselves or become tragedies, and it was the thing that had been pulling at the back of my mind as the county agent read my packet and issued polite caveats. Before I get too deep into what followed, if you want more of these long-form field accounts, ground-level work, footprints, and the kind of evidence that makes you rethink your protocols, consider subscribing. These stories don't tidy themselves up, and if you like the slow unspooling of a case file, there's more to come. We left cameras in legal, low-impact spots, trail cams strapped to juniper trunks, a motion sensor hidden in a rock scrape, one with an infrared trigger placed opposite a known alcove. I insisted on the smallest footprint we could manage. The devices were primitive compared to the gear some university teams run, but they were enough to make a record. A week after we left, I started getting uploads. Most of the clips were nothing. Wind-ruffled grass, a fox slipping by, sunlight moving across stone. That's the boring part of surveillance. You wade through the mundane to find the meaningful. Then one night, a camera in a tight pocket recorded movement that made my hands go cold when I watched it in the truck under sodium lights. The footage was grainy, as most of it would be, but there was a silhouette that rose above the rock like a second person. It moved in a way a quadruped does not. It stepped upright, paused, and at one point something long and curved passed through the frame, feathers catching moonlight like oil. That clip wasn't a smoking gun. It was a thorn, suggestive, but not definitive. When I sent it to the county agent and the regional specialist chain of command, they responded in the same way institutions tend to respond to ambiguous evidence, interested but cautious. The request for proper analysis set off the usual chain. We needed high-resolution image capture, multiple corroborating devices, an on-site specialist with experience in unusual morphology. Each of those requirements comes with time and cost. Meanwhile, the landscape kept its own hours. Over the next few weeks, there were reports of missing animals, one that turned into a claim that the insurance adjuster refused to process until the cause was specified. Harlan's losses continued, in fits rather than waves. Here a calf gone without a sign of struggle, there an older cow left, but missing an organ in a way that matched earlier scenes. The ranch hands adjusted grazing patterns. They put more men out at dusk, and they slept in shifts. Maggie threw herself into watching with the obsession of a person who has been made custodian of ancestral ground. I went back when I could, making the drive out on spare days between other work. Each return tightened my sense that whatever moved through that country learned the land the way a person learns a neighborhood. Routes of least detection, ambush points, places where sound collapses and human presence becomes noisy and obvious. We recovered another cache tucked under an overhang, more skulls, a few bones polished smooth by repeated contact, feathers threaded through crevices in a pattern that suggested arrangement rather than accident. The pattern continued to push me away from comfortable categories. When the regional office proposed a short, targeted survey with more robust equipment, a remote thermal scope from a drone, and a pair of night vision rigs, there was a bureaucratic conversation about permits. Drones aren't forbidden everywhere, but sanctioned flights over private land require permission, and over rugged federal acres they trigger different rules. Requests had to go up channels, liability had to be discussed, specialist teams needed insurance approvals. In the time it took the forms to go from desk to desk, the animal's behavior continued to outpace our paperwork. One late afternoon, after filing another incremental update, I got a call from the county agent. He sounded like a man being careful with both his empathy and his calendar. "We can get a short flight scheduled next week," he said, "but it has to be day only, and the permit window is tight." I told him honestly what my gut said. Day-only flights would likely miss the windows in which we'd seen activity, but honesty doesn't change protocol. I also told him the hard fact I try not to make light of when talking to men whose teams go into the field. Sending people into the swell with incomplete intel is the fastest way to make them casualties. He understood, and the conversation ended with the same institutional compromise I'd grown to expect. Partial attention, delayed full response. That delay set the stage for the amphitheater. Maggie found the amphitheater more out of stubbornness than hope. She'd been down in the breach where ledges fold like pages, and she'd noticed the way small skulls sat on a particular bench. The place had a throat that swallowed sound and opened into tears that made a natural bowl. That's the kind of place predators use to control sightlines. It's the kind of place people use for performance. For us, it became a place to wait. We approached at dusk with the minimum of gear. 2 spotlights we kept dimmed to not broadcast ourselves, a pair of cameras on tripods, my field journal, and enough water for the night. Harlan's old truck stayed patched into the far rim. We sat and listened to the hollow, to the wind scraping the benches. There are moments in the field when the world narrows to a single, steady noise. That evening it was the whisper of sand sliding in small avalanches down a ledge. When animals move through a theater like that, they change the acoustics. A fox in the bowl sounds too large for its size. A raven makes the place feel inhabited. We waited with the patient, bracing stillness of people who know that presence alone can change an encounter. At some point, after the light had gone and the stars had thickened, something answered the stillness. It came first as sound, 3 soft staccato clicks that echoed like a finger tapping across a jar. The sound didn't belong to any animal I could name at first hearing. Then a whistle-like exhale followed, a harmonized pair of notes that slid into each other like a question and an answer. I remember thinking then of Maggie's description of being watched at the spring. The amphitheater was doing its work. Sounds condensed, giving oddness a clarity. A shape stepped onto the rim. It was taller than I'd expected, nearly the height of a man with its head up. And the silhouette had a narrow torso and long legs folded beneath feathering that lay like armor. Its stance was balanced, the center of gravity low, but the posture bipedal. When it moved into the light for a blink, I saw feathers, dark, glossy, edged with iridescent sheens that threw color in the lamp's angle. The thing's head was narrow and angular, the bill not quite a bird's beak but a pointed snout, sheathed in keratinous scales. It watched us with a pair of eyes that held a kind of light I've only seen in a few wilder animals, the look of an animal that tests reactions before committing to a behavior. What I remember most was the talon at the back of its foot, the sickle spur I'd seen in prints. It flexed that rear claw like a craftsman flexes a hand. When it shifted weight, the sound of the talon scraping stone was soft and deliberate. It did not move like a charging predator. It moved more like a being weighing choices. There was no immediate violence in its bearing. It was as if it had come there to observe the assembly, to appraise us. The thing made a series of clicks and whistles that were both foreign and suggestive of syntax. It repeated a pattern, inflection rising and falling. Maggie called in a hoarse whisper, "It's talking." I had a gun in my lap. Old habits die hard. Muscle memory in the field keeps your hands near tools. I also had decades of training about rules of engagement, threat assessment, proportional response, and the legal consequences of firing in a canyon where the gravity of a decision is magnified 100-fold. There is a difference between being suddenly threatened and being tempted to preempt threat out of fear. The difference is the difference between a justified shot and a mistake that becomes a headline and a liability. I thought, in that breath, of the policy forms and the agent's careful phrasing. Imminent public safety threat. This animal's body language did not read as the strike of a desperate carnivore. It read as curiosity mixed with caution. It leaned forward, and with a motion that was almost human, placed something on the slab in front of us. It was a small skull, one we'd seen in the caches, clean and pale, and it rolled it slightly with a claw as if to angle its face toward us. That gesture felt like an offering, an exhibit, or a communication depending on whose mind you applied. Harlan's breath came out ragged. Maggie's hands were steady and small as they curved over the camera housing. There was a long look then, the creature studying our faces the way we had studied its arrangement of bones. Its head cocked, and it emitted a low note that seemed to slow the blood in my veins. For a half-minute, the amphitheater held only that tense register, our comprehension trying to match its movement. Then impossibly it did something I hadn't predicted. It stepped from the rim down into the bowl as if to meet us on equal footing, and set another object on the slab. This time it was a feather, long and barred, laid like a marker beside the skull. It held our gaze and tucked its head, an almost conciliatory bow. The click pattern softened into a single extended tone that matched none of the bird calls I knew, and yet suggested a deliberate act. It was the closest thing to contact I'd had in that canyon, contact without touch, a communication through offerings and sound. In my mind, the policy forms fluttered, classification uncertain, human safety code non-imminent. The decision to shoot thinned under the weight of new evidence, intelligence, ritual, and the possibility, however uneasy, that killing this thing would close a story rather than resolve it. Our shot would have been decisive, but it would also have been final in a way the evidence did not merit. I thought of what it would mean to shoot something that might have been engaging in behavior more complex than predation, what it would mean to take an action that would never allow us to learn. I thought also of my duty to protect the ranch hands and to limit danger. You can't keep both questions open forever. By then the creature had shifted its stance and retreated with calm deliberation, as though concluding a performance. It walked back up the bench, turned once to regard us, and then slipped into the shadow between ledges. The amphitheater swallowed its shape. We sat in the afterglow of that exchange, like examiners with one datum in hand and a dozen hypotheses spinning free. We recorded everything, every click and motion, and I filed the footage with the packet. This time the clip was different from the earlier camera captures. It contained movement, a deliberate placement of objects, a close-range image under low light, but still not the kind of definitive proof that would dissolve bureaucratic hesitancy into immediate action. The evidence was beguiling and maddening, strong enough to raise concern, not strong enough to demand lethal intervention under the rules staffing agencies live by. When I handed the updated materials to the agent, I watched him listen to the audio and then to the video. There was the small human trait of hopefulness you see when a professional thinks a case will finally break, then the reassertion of process. "This is compelling," he said, "but you understand we still have to follow protocols. We'll call in a specialist. We'll consider a controlled approach." Those were the words we had heard before. That night, Harlan and Maggie argued with the practicalities of life, how to keep stock safe, how to justify lost income, how to live with the uncertain presence of something that targeted their herds. They fortified gates in small ways, moved the most vulnerable animals into pens closer to the house, and set up rotating watchers. They refused to create any spectacle that would draw media or outsiders, recognizing that the swell rewards invisibility. The regional response, when it began, was exactly the multi-causal thing I had warned about. A specialist team was assigned, but their scope was narrow. Reconnaissance, non-lethal deterrence trials, and a risk assessment. They were explicit that lethal removal would require significant justification, identification, imminent threat, or public safety emergency. The team made a site visit in daylight and took meticulous notes. They confirmed the track morphology and the arrangement of bones. They agreed that the amphitheater clip suggested a level of behavior beyond simple predation. Their report recommended continued surveillance and caution. The cost-benefit analysis that followed weighed the risk of sending crews into the swell against the probability of a neutral outcome. Within weeks, the political tenor shifted toward containment rather than confrontation. The reasons were practical and mundane: lack of rapid access to experienced personnel who could operate safely in that terrain, the hazard assessments that flagged the swell as high risk for rescues and recovery, the expense of prolonged field operations, and the public relations hazard of acknowledging an ambiguous, potentially alarming phenomenon without a clear plan. There were additional worries. If word leaked and people started showing up with guns, how would that change the animals' behavior? Would it put the public in more danger than the status quo? Those conversations, held in offices with maps and policy binders, are not glamorous, but they are decisive. The agency's choice, document, monitor, and avoid kinetic action, began to look less like neglect and more like a weighed, if conservative, calculus. To men in the field, the calculus sometimes reads as abandonment. To those making the decision, it reads as harm mitigation under conditions of incomplete information and limited resources. Both readings are true in their context. For Harlan and Maggie, the result was less satisfying. The creature's activity did not stop, because we sat on our hands and processed forms. Predation continued in a pattern, not nightly rampage but periodic, selective strikes that bled the ranch's yield and frayed the family's sleep. They adapted as best they could, adjusted stock rotation, moved birthing schedules, hired neighbors for watch shifts. But adaptation is not a solution. It is management under duress. As the months moved, I took to driving out less as an investigator and more as an intermediary, someone who could carry updates to the family and translate agency language into actionable steps that did not violate law or principle. We built a tacit compact. The agencies kept low-key surveillance going. I kept a record in my journal and passed on anything new I saw. Harlan and Maggie kept watch and made small legal mitigations. The compact bought time and kept the situation off the front pages. Then, months after the amphitheater face-to-face, there was a change that crystallized everything we'd been dealing with. One late fall morning, a young ranch hand named Luis failed to return from a late shift. He was a careful kid, steady, and he knew the terrain around the pastures. His absence set off a search that dragged men through the canyons in a way our watchers hadn't been prepared for. I joined the search because I knew the ground and the protocols, and because a missing person changes institutional priorities. Agencies move differently when someone might be injured or worse. We found Luis at the edge of a wash, alive but shaken, crouched near a depression where the soil still held a print we all knew. He'd been out checking fence lines and had seen something, spent the hours crouched and motionless until morning. He insisted he had not been touched, and there were no defensive wounds, but his eyes carried the blankness of someone who had been faced with something their mind could not name. He said he'd felt studied, and his recall of the hours blurred. He had a mark on his shoulder that might have been a scrape, nothing more. The search concluded, and the narrative, missing ranch hand, found, got folded into the county logs with the care those files receive. That incident did something obvious. It turned the ambiguous into an institutional priority. A missing person, even briefly, raises the stakes. The agencies accelerated their review and requested a coordinated plan that included safety protocols for personnel working in the swell. But even with that acceleration, there remained an operational truth. To act decisively in the swell meant accepting a non-trivial probability that someone would be hurt in the attempt. The terrain is unforgiving, with drop-offs and loose stone that turn a bad step into a rescue mission. The agency's liability calculus never favored sending in teams without near certainty of containment and retrieval ability. In the weeks that followed, we planned a joint operation with a small regional team and a specially cleared field unit. The plan was precise and constrained: daytime surveillance with cross-referenced thermal imaging, a rapid extraction route mapped and rehearsed, and a non-lethal deterrence gear set. The hope was to at least pin behavior and maybe deter an escalation. We went in with more gear than I'd brought to the amphitheater. Radios hummed. The team moved like a measured organism, positions taken, observation points established. We were a fusion of agency protocol and local desperation. The canyon felt narrower with so many humans in it. There was a sense that our visibility had already altered what we would find. The team's thermal run yielded a track that led to a bench we had not yet photographed, a shelf smoothed by repeated movement. On that bench were curated remains and a small arrangement of feathers forming a line toward a narrow alcove. The narrow alcove looked like a throat swallowed by a larger rock. We set an observational post downwind and waited. Night fell with the patient inevitability the swell gives to everything. We watched monitors and listened. At a little after midnight, a thermal signature moved across the screen, a narrow vertical mass that stood and then stepped out onto the bench. The live feed made the thing look more lithe than it had in daylight. The noise in the canyon seemed to compress. Every sound had the clarity of a bell in an empty room. This time we were not alone in watching. The agency had insisted on 2 medics and a trained extraction crew on standby. They would not, they told us, authorize engagement without a clear, imminent threat. Their role was to keep watchers safe and to recover injured personnel if required. You could see in their posture the tension between the desire to act and the mandate to protect. The creature, when it appeared, did not sprint or lunge. It stepped with the careful gait we'd seen before and approached the ledge where a camera had been watching. For a heartbeat, the canyon felt like a theater watching itself, predator and observers in a small set of lines. It paused at the camera, and to the astonishment of half the men in the team, manipulated it with a talon. It turned the housing so the lens faced its own alcove, as if to show us something. Then, in a motion that looked almost like gesture, it placed a feather on the tripod base and emitted a series of clicks that resolved into a rhythmic pattern. The sequence lasted no longer than a minute, and then it withdrew into the dark. The live feed recorded that pattern and the gesture, and the video would become part of the file. Interpretation of that moment split the assembled professionals into camps. Some said ritual, some said marking, some said the creature was mocking us. I, after standing in enough canyons to know how people cop mental hazards, thought the thing was communicating in a way we could not pass, the same way a person in a language you don't speak can still make meaning. We had in that minute enough to force a policy question. Does a non-human agent that demonstrates consistent non-random behavior and deliberate contact constitute a public safety hazard that warrants escalation beyond monitoring? For the agenting agencies, that question translated into a list of conditions. Can the entity be reliably located? Can personnel be kept safe in an extraction? Is lethal force justifiable under a regulatory code that typically requires immediate threat? Those were the thresholds. The event at the camera pushed the problem toward them, but did not cross the lines with the bluntness required to trigger lethal action. The creature had not attacked. It had not taken a human. It had engaged with our equipment, offered objects, and then left. The pathological slipperiness of the situation was that we could read meaning into the act, but nothing in policy allowed meaning to substitute for imminent risk. The weeks that followed were the most consequential for public messaging. A rumor had slipped into a local paper, and a television crew made a drive-by that ended with a polite refusal to get out of their car. Harlan, who had guarded his land with a stubborn dignity, feared what publicity would bring. Curiosity seekers, hunters, or worse, people with weapons and without sense of the complexity we were dealing with. He asked us to keep things quiet. The agencies, wary of litigation and headlines, leaned toward silence unless forced to speak. That silence became, in the public eye, tantamount to inaction. That accumulation, the creature's ambiguous intelligence, the swell's deadly geography, the limited resources and safety protocols of agencies, the legal thresholds for intervention, and the social consequences of publicity, came to a head in a meeting convened in a county conference room. Around the table were the regional agent, representatives from wildlife services, a liaison from the county sheriff's office, Harlan, Maggie, and me. We walked through the evidence: the kill signature, track morphology, cache arrangements, amphitheater footage, the Luis incident, and the camera interference. We debated liability, resource allocation, and the probability models that inform whether an operation will succeed. By the end of that meeting, the conclusion, however unsatisfying, had hardened into policy. For the foreseeable future, active field operations were to be limited. The agencies would continue to monitor remotely, advise ranchers on non-invasive mitigation, and maintain a contingency plan if the entity escalated into direct human harm. The sheriff's office would log incidents, and the county would prepare public advisories should a trend toward increased public risk emerge. But the lean toward non-kinetic management was clear. There it was, the formalized answer to the title. Wildlife control, as a function of the county and regional services, stepped back from active intervention in the San Rafael Swell because the sum of constraints made action riskier than observation. It wasn't cowardice or negligence, it was a composite of 1. An unknown predator that did not fit standard taxonomies, kills with surgical selection, caches suggestive of ritual or display, and behavior implying learning or communication. Without identification, policies for removal and control are constrained. 2. Terrain that is inherently hazardous, vertiginous benches, narrow canyons, and routes that make retrieval and rescue operations difficult and dangerous. Safety protocols in place to protect personnel often preclude prolonged or risky operations unless an immediate danger to human life is demonstrated. 3. The creature's apparent operational adaptability, movement across benches, ability to avoid traps, and selection of human quiet hours reduced the chances that conventional capture or deterrence would succeed. Given a low probability of success, agencies hesitate to expose personnel to high-risk environments. 4. Bureaucratic and legal constraints, permits for drones or specialized gear, insurance concerns, and the necessity of demonstrating probable cause for lethal action. Without clear classification, liability calculations favor monitoring over engagement. 5. Social risk management. The fear that publicizing the problem would attract outsiders, create panic, or lead to unregulated intervention by civilians. Agencies often choose to mitigate human behavior and exposure rather than risk escalating the situation. Those 5 fold together into a rational if frustrating decision. In offices with maps and liability memos, the course that looks like retreat is often the one that avoids immediate human casualties. For people like Harlan and Maggie, who live with the daily impact, that decision feels like abandonment. Both perspectives are reasonable, they just come from different vantage points. After the policy meeting, we returned to daily life with more equipment in our pockets and fewer expectations. The agencies kept a watch, we kept a log. Harlan built a second night pen and paid men to stay awake on shifts he could not fill himself. Maggie started a ledger of lost animals and filed notes in a small notebook she kept by her sink. Life recalibrated around the new normal. For me, the matter did not end with policy. The animal's final choice in the amphitheater and its later gestures at the camera left me with a professional appetite that could not be fully sated. There remained questions about cognition and motive I could not answer with forms and observations alone. I haunted the canyon edges sometimes, more to be near the place that had imposed itself on us than to hunt. The swell had altered my sense of what fieldwork could produce. Sometimes evidence leads to action, and sometimes evidence leads only to restraint. Months later, on a cold morning when frost rimed the juniper and the light broke the way it does in that country, slow and revealing, I walked to the amphitheater one more time. The skulls were still where we'd seen them, their pale faces softened by lichen and wind. A feather lay on a bench at the same angle the creature had placed it months before. Tracks led away into the throat of the rock and vanished. I sat as I had before and listened. The land kept its indifferent rhythms. There were no sudden movements, no dramatic finale. The most dangerous things are often the ones that don't need to announce themselves. The creature, if it still moved in those canyons, did so on its own terms. It kept doing what it had long done, selecting, arranging, choosing. It had shown us enough to change the conversation, and not enough to end it. When people ask me why wildlife control walked away from the San Rafael Swell, I tell them the same thing I told Harlan in his truck the day we left the ridge. It wasn't a single decision made in spite of courage or care. It was a confluence of constraints grounded in the evidence. Agencies have mandates: protect the public, protect personnel, and operate within legal and financial limits. When the problem on the table resists characterization, when the terrain makes fieldwork perilous, when the probability of safe, decisive intervention is low, The pragmatic choice is to limit direct action. It is not a moral failing so much as a professional calculus. But that calculus, for all its reasoning, leaves a bitter residue. It leaves ranchers counting losses and watching ledges with a tension that never fully relaxes. It leaves investigators with an intellectual hunger for answers, and with the memory of a creature that looked at us in a way that suggested more than instinct. And it leaves the swell itself, patient and implacable, continuing as it always has. A place that harbors secrets because the geography and the history of isolation allow them to persist. I'll close with an image I keep returning to. The amphitheater at dusk. Benches hollowed by time, small skulls arranged like audience members, and a single feather placed with care. That feather could be a mark, a message, or merely a trace of daily life. Because we never forced the issue, because the agencies ultimately chose to minimize risk rather than escalate danger, the feather remains ambiguous. So does the creature that left it. If you've been following this account and have thoughts, theories, or even your own experiences in the lonely country, leave them in the comments. I'm collecting accounts and evidence, not to flinch away from the unknown, but to understand how we live with what we can't easily classify. The swell has not expelled the thing that moves there. It has just rendered human control more complicated than usual. That's why, in practical terms, wildlife control stepped back. I still drive out, sometimes alone, to sit on a rim and listen. The sound of a canyon at evening is a language I'm still learning, and sometimes it speaks in clicks and whistles I cannot yet translate. The skulls remain on their ledges. The tracks come and go with wind and season. Life on the ranches finds a way to continue around the shape of a problem the institutions could not neatly fold into policy. We do what we can with what we have. We document, we protect, we adapt, and we respect the limits of both our knowledge and our authority. There is no tidy end to this story. There may never be. But there is an explanation for the decision that title names, a knot of practical limits bound to the evidence we had on hand. The swell keeps its own counsel. Whatever else is out there, it has the advantage of place, and sometimes place is enough to make the best-laid human plans retreat.